There's a moment that happens in almost every organization that has ever run a project with a deadline. The deadline is slipping. Everyone can feel it. And someone in the room, usually someone senior, says the 4 words that feel like obvious common sense. Let's add more people. It feels like arithmetic. If one person can do a task in 10 days, 2 people should be able to do it in 5. Throw more hands at the problem, and the problem shrinks. Except, for a huge and predictable category of work, that arithmetic is not just wrong, it's backwards. Adding more people to a late project often makes it later, not sooner. And the person who proved this, decades ago, with real data from a real disaster, was a software engineer named Fred Brooks. Fred Brooks was leading IBM's development of the OS 360 operating system in the 1960s, one of the most ambitious software projects attempted up to that point in history. It was falling badly behind schedule. Under pressure from management and from the calendar, IBM did the instinctive thing. They added more engineers to speed it up, and the project didn't speed up. It got later. Brooks watched this happen in real time, on a project he was personally responsible for, and instead of just quietly absorbing the lesson and moving on, he wrote it down. In 1975, he published a book called The Mythical Man Month, and inside it he stated what's now known across the software industry, and increasingly across other industries too, as Brooks's law. Adding manpower to a late software project makes it later. It's one of the most quoted lines in the history of management writing, precisely because almost everyone who has run a real project has felt the truth of it firsthand at least once, usually painfully. So why does this happen? Why doesn't more people simply mean more output, proportionally the way it seems like it should? Brooks laid out the mechanism clearly, and it holds up just as well 50 years later. The first piece is training cost. A new person joining a project that's already underway doesn't arrive ready to contribute. They need to understand the existing code, the existing plan, the existing decisions that have already been made, and the reasons behind them, many of which were never written down anywhere, and live only in the heads of the people already on the team. Who teaches them that? The existing team members, the very people who are already behind schedule and already under pressure. So, in the short term, adding a person doesn't add capacity, it subtracts capacity, because your most productive, most knowledgeable people stop producing and start training instead, right at the moment you can least afford it. Brooks called this an inescapable feature of the situation, not a management failure. It's baked into the physics of transferring complex knowledge from one brain to another. It simply takes time, and that time has to come from somewhere, and it comes from the people who don't have any time to spare. The second piece, and honestly the more devastating one over the life of a project, is communication overhead. Brooks pointed out something almost embarrassingly simple once you see it. The number of communication channels in a team doesn't grow at the same rate as the team itself. It grows much faster, because every person has to potentially coordinate with every other person. With 2 people on a project, there's exactly 1 channel of communication to manage between them. With 5 people, there are 10 channels. With 10 people, there are 45 channels. The formula is n times n minus 1 divided by 2, and the growth is quadratic, not linear. Double the team size, and you don't double the coordination burden, you roughly quadruple it. Every one of those channels represents time spent in meetings, time spent aligning on decisions, time spent making sure 2 subsystems built by 2 different people actually fit together correctly, time spent resolving disagreements about approach that simply didn't exist when there were only 2 or 3 people who already agreed on everything because they'd hashed it out early. On some projects, particularly ones where the work is tightly coupled, meaning one person's output directly depends on understanding another person's ongoing decisions in real time, this coordination overhead can grow large enough to completely swallow the extra output the new people were supposed to provide. You end up with more total people, more total meetings, more total confusion, and the same, or worse, delivery date. Brooks gave this whole phenomenon a memorable name, the mythical Man Month. The Man Month is a unit that shows up on every project plan. The idea that one person working for 1 month produces 1 unit of person month of output, and that these units are interchangeable and additive, so 9 people working for 1 month should produce the same output as 1 person working for 9 months. Brooks's point was that this only holds true for tasks that can be perfectly divided among workers with zero coordination cost between them. Tasks like picking cotton or digging a ditch, where 9 workers really can finish in 1/9 the time of one worker, because each worker's portion is fully independent of every other worker's portion. Most complex work, and almost all knowledge work, does not divide that way. Writing a coherent piece of software, designing a coherent product, building a coherent marketing campaign, these all require the pieces to fit together in ways that depend on shared understanding, shared decisions, and constant small adjustments as the work unfolds. You cannot take 9 women and get a baby in 1 month, Brooks famously said. And the same logic applies to almost any project where the output has to be internally consistent rather than simply summed from independent parts. This isn't a software-only problem, even though it was discovered in software. It shows up anywhere you have a tightly coupled project racing against a hard deadline. Think about a product redesign at a mid-size company. The visual design, the underlying architecture, and the content strategy all have to agree with each other constantly as decisions get made. If that redesign starts falling behind, and leadership responds by parachuting in 3 additional designers 2 weeks before launch, those designers now have to be caught up on months of accumulated context, brand decisions, user research findings, technical constraints, all of it, by the very core team that's already sprinting toward the deadline. The core team's output drops during the onboarding window, exactly when it needed to be at its highest, and the new designers, even once ramped up, introduce stylistic inconsistencies that now have to be reconciled by someone, adding yet another layer of coordination work that didn't exist before they arrived. Marketing launches show the same pattern. A product launch campaign is running behind, the copy isn't finalized, the creative assets aren't approved, and the launch date is fixed because it's tied to a trade show or an earnings call that can't move. Leadership adds 2 more copywriters and a second creative agency to catch up. Now there are 2 creative visions that need reconciling into one coherent campaign voice. 2 sets of stakeholders who need alignment meetings added to the calendar, and the original marketing lead, who was the only person who fully understood the campaign's strategic logic, is now spending half their week in alignment calls instead of finishing the actual work. The launch date doesn't move up. Often it moves back because now there's an entirely new problem to solve, namely making 4 different people's work sound like it came from one coherent voice. And that problem didn't exist before the extra headcount arrived to help. Merger integrations are maybe the most brutal version of this, because they combine tight coupling with enormous scale. 2 companies merge, and the integration timeline is slipping. Systems aren't talking to each other, processes aren't aligned, and someone decides the fix is to staff up the integration team dramatically, pulling in consultants, temporary project managers, extra analysts from both companies. Each new person needs to understand 2 different companies' histories, 2 different sets of systems, 2 different cultures, and the political sensitivities layered on top of all of it. Sensitivities that are, frankly, impossible to fully explain to someone new in a briefing document. The people who do understand all of that, the small handful who've been steering the integration since day one, become the bottleneck for onboarding everyone else. And meanwhile, the actual integration work slows to a crawl because those same people are now spending their days in orientation sessions instead of making the decisions that were supposed to move the merger forward. Customer support crises during a product launch show a smaller, faster version of the same dynamic, which is useful precisely because it plays out over days instead of months, so the whole arc is easy to see clearly. A company launches a new feature, something goes wrong, and support tickets flood in faster than the existing team can handle. The obvious move is to pull in extra staff from other departments to answer tickets. If the tickets are simple and repetitive, say, everyone is hitting the exact same known bug with the exact same known workaround, this works beautifully, because each borrowed staffer can be handed a one-line script and start resolving tickets within the hour, with almost no ongoing coordination needed between them. But if the tickets are varied, and the underlying issue is still being diagnosed by engineering, pulling in extra support staff can actually slow the real fix down, because the engineers who are trying to isolate the root cause now have to field a stream of clarifying questions from newly onboarded staff who don't yet have the pattern-matching instincts the original team built up over the play. First frantic hour of the incident. The extra hands help with visible ticket volume, which looks good on a dashboard, while quietly starving the actual diagnostic work of the senior attention it needs to end the incident for good. This is Brooks's law compressed into 48 hours instead of 48 weeks, and it's worth watching for specifically in fast-moving incident response because the pressure to just get more people on it is at its absolute strongest exactly when the coordination cost is hardest to see coming. Engineering leaders inside the software industry, the same industry where Brooks first identified this, eventually built entire team structuring philosophies around taking the law seriously rather than just quoting it at parties. The two-pizza team rule that Amazon became known for, the idea that no team should be bigger than what 2 pizzas can feed, is a direct descendant of Brooks's communication channel math. Keep the team small enough that the number of coordination channels stays manageable, and you keep velocity high. Once a team crosses roughly 8 to 10 people, many engineering organizations will deliberately split it into 2 smaller teams with a clean interface between them, rather than let it keep growing as one increasingly coordination-heavy unit, precisely because they've internalized that growth in headcount and growth in output are not the same curve past a certain size. Now, it's worth being fair to the instinct here, because add more people isn't always wrong, and Brooks himself never claimed it was. The key variable is how divisible the remaining work actually is. If a project has a component that genuinely can be split into independent, parallel chunks with minimal ongoing coordination, say, translating a finished document into 15 languages, or running the same well-defined test script across 50 different device configurations, adding more people to those specific chunks really does speed things up close to linearly, because there's very little shared context required, and very little that one worker's decisions affect another worker's work. The mistake isn't headcount itself. The mistake is applying the just add people instinct uniformly, without first asking whether the specific remaining work is divisible or tightly coupled. A wise manager facing a slipping deadline doesn't reflexively say yes or no to more staff. They break the remaining work down and ask, piece by piece, which parts could genuinely absorb new hands productively, and which parts would only get slower with more cooks stirring the pot. There's also a timing dimension Brooks pointed out that's easy to miss. Even divisible work becomes hard to parallelize productively once a deadline is very close, because the training and ramp-up time simply won't pay for itself before the deadline arrives. Adding a person 3 months before a deadline might be a genuinely good call. Adding that same person 3 weeks before the same deadline, even for divisible work, might cost more in onboarding time than it returns in output before the clock runs out. So the calculation isn't fixed. It changes as the deadline approaches, and the honest move for a manager is to run that calculation explicitly rather than treating add people as a single always or never decision made once at the start of a crisis. So what's the actual takeaway for a manager staring at a slipping deadline right now? First, resist the reflex to solve a schedule problem with a staffing decision before you've asked whether the remaining work is divisible or tightly coupled. Draw the actual dependency map if you have to, even roughly, on a whiteboard, and be specific about which pieces truly stand alone versus which pieces depend on a shared, evolving understanding that lives mostly in a few people's heads. Second, if you do decide to add people, do the math on communication channels honestly, not optimistically. Ask yourself and your team plainly whether the coordination cost of onboarding and aligning new people will exceed the output they'll realistically add before the deadline hits, given how much runway is actually left, and get a real number, even a rough one, rather than a vague feeling of more hands has to help somehow. Third, and this is the part people resist the most because it feels passive when everyone wants to feel like they're doing something, consider that protecting your existing team's focus, shielding them from the very meetings and status updates that leadership tends to pile on during a crisis, might do more for the deadline than any new hire could. That means saying no to well-intentioned, let's sync on this requests from adjacent teams, no to daily status decks that eat an hour of your best engineer's day, and no to reflexive reinforcements even when saying no feels uncomfortable in the moment because it looks like you're doing less. Fourth, if the deadline genuinely cannot move and the work genuinely cannot be parallelized without cost, have the harder conversation early about scope instead of headcount. Cutting what the project delivers, shipping a smaller version on time instead of the full version late, is very often a better outcome for the business than either blowing the deadline or blowing the budget on reinforcements that slow things down further. Sometimes the single most effective move available to a manager staring down a late, tightly coupled project is the counterintuitive one. Add nobody, protect the people already doing the work, trim what done actually means if you have to, and let the team finish what they started without diluting it. There's one more layer worth adding, because it explains why this mistake keeps repeating even inside organizations that have heard of Brooks's Law and nod along whenever it's mentioned. The instinct to add people isn't really about the math at all, most of the time. It's about how a slipping deadline feels from a leadership seat. Watching a deadline slip while doing nothing visible feels like negligence, even when doing nothing visible is genuinely the correct call. Adding staff is a highly visible action. It shows up in a headcount request, an email announcing reinforcements, a slide in the next steering committee update that says, "We've added capacity to this workstream." It looks like leadership taking the problem seriously, and it protects the leader from the accusation of having sat on their hands while a deadline burned. Protecting your existing team's focus and quietly saying no to reinforcements, even when that's the right call, doesn't generate any of that visible reassurance, and it can actually look like inaction to anyone watching from outside the team. This is a big part of why Brooks's Law keeps getting rediscovered painfully instead of simply being applied preventively. The correct action is often invisible, and the incorrect action is highly visible and socially rewarded in the short term, right up until the delivery date arrives and proves it wrong. If you've ever watched a project get later the moment leadership tried to rescue it with more headcount, or if you've seen the opposite, a case where adding people actually did save a deadline, tell me what happened down in the comments. Because both stories teach the same underlying lesson from two different directions.